Have you ever wondered why some people seem to be born with the gift of organization while others struggle with chaos every day? I used to be in the second group. 15 years ago, my house was a total mess, and today? Well, people ask me if I hired a personal organizer. But no, I discovered something far more valuable: tricks that no one tells you. Do you know that feeling of walking into your home and feeling the weight of the world on your shoulders just by seeing the clutter? That was exactly how I felt every day. 3 children, a husband, 2 dogs, and a 120 square meter house that seemed to shrink a little more each day. I tried all those basic tips you find everywhere: buying storage containers, making lists, waking up earlier. Nothing worked in the long run. That's when I realized I was doing it all wrong. Organization doesn't start with pretty products or complex systems. It starts with something no one talks about: understanding your lazy moments. Yes, you read that correctly. Instead of fighting them, I learned to use them to my advantage. My first revolutionary trick was what I call the inverted 30-second rule. Instead of trying to put everything away immediately, I created strategic transition zones in each room. These are small designated spaces where I can temporarily leave frequently used items without making them look like clutter. In my case, an elegant tray by the entrance holds keys, mail, and masks. In the kitchen, a small floating shelf next to the microwave houses those spices I use daily. The secret is not trying to change your habits overnight, but rather creating an environment that adapts to your real lifestyle. For example, I noticed that I always left clothes on the bedroom chair. Instead of forcing myself to put them away immediately, I installed a decorative clothes rack on the wall. Now, these pieces become part of the decor, not part of the mess. Another insight that changed my life was understanding that organization isn't about having fewer things, but about creating enjoyable rituals. I developed what I call the afternoon coffee method. Every day at 3 p.m., I take a break for a special coffee. During those 15 minutes, I do a micro-organization of a single space, about the size of a shoebox. It's small enough not to be discouraging and satisfying enough to build motivation. The truth that no one tells you is that disorganization is often a symptom, not the problem. When I began to observe my patterns, I realized that the most chaotic days coincided with moments of anxiety or emotional overload. So, I created a mess journal. Yes, that exists. For a week, I photographed the messiest areas of the house and noted how I was feeling at that moment. The patterns that emerged were revealing. I discovered, for example, that the area near the kitchen door was always a mess on Mondays. Do you know why? Because it was the day I tried to make up for all the relaxation of the weekend by piling on too many tasks. The solution wasn't to create more organizing rules, but to redistribute activities more evenly throughout the week. And here's something I've never seen anyone mention: I created a mess heat map. I literally drew the floor plan of my house and marked with different colors the places where disorder accumulated the most. Red for critical areas, yellow for moderate ones, and green for those that naturally stayed organized. This helped me understand that I needed different solutions for each space. The second trick that revolutionized my home was what I call the reverse energy system. You know when you're too tired to organize, but you can't relax with the clutter around? I discovered that there are low-energy tasks that can be done even when we are exhausted, and they have a surprising impact on overall organization. For example, I created the couch ritual. While watching my favorite soap opera, I separate small items into a compartmentalized tray, from buttons to paper clips. The interesting thing is that this almost mechanical activity ends up being both relaxing and productive. In 1 week, I organized my entire sewing box this way, without feeling like I was really working. Another fascinating discovery was what I call invisible decision points. These are those moments in the day when we unconsciously decide whether to maintain organization or create chaos. For instance, I noticed that whenever I came home from the supermarket tired, I would just toss everything onto the shelves haphazardly. The solution? I created a decompression zone in the pantry, an empty shelf dedicated exclusively to receiving groceries. I only organize it properly the next day, when I have more energy. I also developed the contrast method. Instead of trying to keep every environment spotless, I strategically chose a few spaces to be perfectly organized. These are small areas that I maintain as showcases. A bookshelf in the living room, a specific drawer in the kitchen. The interesting thing is that these spaces end up serving as inspiration and a model for the rest of the house, besides giving me a sense of accomplishment when everything else is in chaos. One of the most surprising discoveries was understanding the power of what I call controlled chaos. Some areas of the house naturally tend to get messier, like the kids' study table or the kitchen counter during meal preparations. Instead of fighting that, I created permitted chaos zones, defined spaces where clutter can exist temporarily without contaminating the rest of the area. I remember when my eldest daughter was in architecture school. She always spread her materials all over the living room table, which drove me crazy. That's when I had the idea of creating a mobile studio, a foldable table on wheels that she could take anywhere in the house. The mess still existed, but now it was controllable and, more importantly, mobile. The third trick that changed everything was what I call emotional context organization. Unlike traditional organization by categories, I began grouping items based on how I feel when I use them. For example, I created a tough day kit. A pretty box containing my favorite tea, a scented candle, my crossword puzzle book, and other little treats. It's always organized and accessible because I know that when I need it, I don't want to waste time searching. Another practice I implemented was the 5 senses challenge. For each area of the house, I make sure that at least one element caters to each sense. In the kitchen, for example, I have an aroma diffuser, smell, a small music box, hearing, beautiful and organized containers, sight, surfaces with different textures for utensils, touch, and my favorite spices always within reach, taste. This creates a complete sensory experience that motivates me to keep the space organized. And you know that junk drawer everyone has? I transformed mine into what I call the drawer of possibilities. Instead of being a random storage area, it became a curated space for items that can spark creative ideas. When I clean the house and find something interesting that I don't know where to store, I put it there. Once a month, I have a curation session. It's amazing how seemingly useless objects can turn into creative solutions for organization. The fourth trick I discovered was what I call the emotional anchors method. I realized that we keep certain areas organized not out of discipline, but because of emotional connections. For example, the little coffee nook in my kitchen is always spotless because it reminds me of mornings with my grandmother. So, I began deliberately creating these connections in other areas of the house. In the laundry room, which used to be my biggest organizational nightmare, I installed a small sound system. Now, whenever I fold clothes, I listen to podcasts or audiobooks. This positive association turned a monotonous task into an almost therapeutic moment. The result? The laundry room rarely becomes disorganized, because it's now a space that brings me pleasure. An interesting discovery was what I named organizational pressure points. These are those specific spots that, when disorganized, trigger a domino effect of chaos throughout the house. In my case, I identified that the counter between the kitchen and living room was one of those points. I decided to transform it into what I call a sorting station. Every object that passes through there has 24 hours to find its final destination, otherwise it goes into a special box in the office. I also developed the concept of breathing zones. These are small empty spaces strategically maintained in each room. For example, I keep 20% of each shelf free. This not only creates a visual sense of organization but also provides flexible space for accommodating temporary or seasonal items. The fifth revolutionary trick was what I dubbed the emotional seasonal rotation system. Unlike the traditional changing of clothes by season, I do a complete rotation of decorative and functional objects based not only on the weather but also on my emotional state and the family's activities during each period of the year. For instance, in winter, besides switching blankets and heavy clothing, I also reorganize the kitchen to have more space for preparing warm and comforting dishes. I changed the layout of the furniture to create cozier areas for socializing. It's amazing how this conscious adaptation of the space helps to naturally keep everything more organized. A practice I developed was the 3 questions ritual. Before putting anything away, I ask myself, does this bring me joy? Already known from the KonMari method, but I add 2 extra questions. At what moment in my life will this be useful? And how does this connect with my story? These questions help me create a more meaningful and lasting organization system. Another discovery was the power of what I call micro-organized scenes. Instead of trying to keep an entire room perfectly tidy, I create small, visually pleasing setups in strategic spots. A small tray with a vase of flowers, some artistically stacked books, and a candle, for example. These micro-scenes act as visual anchors that inspire us to keep the rest of the space organized. And here's something I've never seen anyone mention: I created an organizational memories map. For each area of the house, I associated a happy memory related to organization. In the pantry, for example, I put an old photo of my mother organizing jam jars. These visual memories serve as constant motivation and make the process of maintaining order much more meaningful. I also implemented what I call the reverse reward system. Instead of rewarding myself after organizing something, I start with something enjoyable. For instance, I make my favorite tea before I begin organizing the drawers. This creates a positive association with the task right from the start and makes the whole process more pleasant. The sixth trick that completely changed my relationship with organization was what I dubbed the spatial narrative method. I realized that when we give a deeper meaning to our spaces, we naturally feel more inclined to keep them in order. I began to think of each room as a chapter in our family story. For example, I transformed the hallway into a gallery of time. Instead of being just a passageway, it now tells our story through photos and small objects organized chronologically. Not only did it look beautiful, but creating this narrative made me reflect on what truly mattered to keep and what was just senseless accumulation. Another practice I adopted was the traveling object ritual. Every week, I choose a decorative or utilitarian item and move it to a new spot in the house. This not only refreshes the environments, but also forces me to rethink the organization of the space that receives it. It's amazing how a simple vase can completely change the dynamics of a shelf or table. I also developed the concept of emotional niches. These are small spaces dedicated to specific emotions. I have, for example, a gratitude corner in the kitchen, where I keep a bulletin board with family thank you notes. This not only motivates me to keep the area organized, but also cultivates a positive emotional environment. A fascinating discovery was what I call the organizational mirror effect. I noticed that the spaces we kept most organized reflected aspects of our life that were going well. For example, when I started taking better care of my health, I realized that the food preparation area in the kitchen naturally became more organized. I began to intentionally use this insight, focusing on organizing areas that symbolized aspects of life we wanted to improve. The Orphan Object Challenge was another strategy one implemented. Every month, we choose an object that doesn't have a designated place in the house. Instead of simply finding a corner to shove it into, we hold a family meeting to decide if it really deserves to stay and, if so, to create a meaningful space for it. This not only keeps the house organized, but also makes us constantly reflect on what we truly value. I also created what I call seasonal transition zones. These are flexible spaces that adapt according to the season. For example, the bench in the entrance hall transforms. In summer, it has a basket for hats and sunscreen. In winter, it becomes a mini closet for coats and umbrellas. This planned flexibility prevents the accumulation of out-of-season items and keeps the organization fluid. The gift box method was a revelation. For items I rarely use but don't want to discard, like that set of tea from Grandma, I pack them as if they were gifts. This not only protects them but also transforms the act of storing them into something special. When I need them, it feels like opening a present for myself. I also implemented the energy rotation system. With every change of season, I completely reorganize a room. Not just swapping objects, but completely rethinking the layout and function of the space. This prevents organizational boredom and keeps us connected to the family's changing needs. Finally, I adopted what I call the legacy rule. Before buying anything new, I ask myself, does this have the potential to become a family heirloom? This simple question drastically reduced impulsive purchases and made me value the items we already have, resulting in less accumulation and more meaningful organization. The seventh and final trick that transformed my house into an organized space was what I call the living curation method. I realized that true organization is not static but a continuous process that reflects our personal and family evolution. I began to treat our home like a constantly changing exhibition, where every object tells a current and relevant story. I implemented the quarterly re-evaluation ritual. Every 3 months, I dedicate a weekend to review each room with a fresh perspective. It's not just cleaning, but a deep reflection on how that space is serving our current needs. Sometimes, a simple rearrangement of furniture or changing the function of a corner can bring new energy and natural organization. One practice I adopted was the object journal. I started writing short stories about significant items in the house. For example, the old armchair in the living room got a discreet tag with a QR code that links to a text about how my husband and I bought it on our honeymoon. This not only adds emotional depth to our belongings but also makes us think twice before accumulating meaningless stuff. I also developed the concept of controlled creativity zones. These are specific areas where creative mess is allowed and even encouraged. In the case of my children, we created a chaos wall in their bedroom, an entire wall they can use for collages, drawings, and ongoing projects. This channels creative disorder into a defined space, keeping the rest of the environment organized. The object partnership system was another interesting discovery. I started grouping items not by category but by their joint use. For example, in the kitchen, I keep the olive oil, salt, and favorite herbs on a tray near the stove. This not only makes meal preparation easier but also creates a natural organization logic that everyone in the family can intuitively follow. I implemented what I call the magic 5-minute routine. Every day before bed, each family member dedicates exactly 5 minutes to organize a small space. It could be a drawer, a shelf, or even a bedside table. The secret is consistency. These small daily moments prevent the accumulation of major messes. Another practice I adopted was the Forgotten Object Challenge. Once a month, we choose an item that we haven't used in a long time but still keep. We place it in a prominent spot and challenge ourselves to use it in the coming week. If we can't incorporate it into our routine, it's a sign that it's time to donate or discard it. I also created the Family Flow Map. I observed the movement patterns of each family member throughout the house and reorganized the spaces to facilitate those natural flows. For example, we created an exit station near the door with everything we need to grab when leaving the house. This drastically reduced the chaos of rushed mornings. The anticipated heirloom method was a revelation. Instead of saving sentimental objects for a distant future, I began passing them on to my children right away, incorporating them into the decoration of their rooms or study areas. This not only frees up space but creates deeper emotional connections with our family history in the present. Finally, I adopted the principle of flexible minimalism. It's not about having less for the sake of having less, but about creating spaces that adapt to our changing needs. I invested in modular furniture and versatile storage solutions that can be easily reconfigured as our needs evolve. Reflecting on this journey, I realize that true organization goes far beyond simply a place for everything. It is a continuous process of creating a home that reflects who we are, our stories, and our aspirations. Every object, every space, becomes part of a larger narrative, the story of our family. These 7 tricks are not just about keeping the house tidy, they are about creating an environment that nourishes our souls, facilitates our routines, and evolves with us. Organization, when done with intention and meaning, becomes a form of self-care and care for those we love. And the most surprising part? I discovered that a truly organized home is not necessarily one that looks like it came out of a decorating magazine. It's one that works perfectly for those who live in it, that tells their story, and that adapts to their ever-changing needs.